This video is brought to you by Nebula. For the past few months, the price of oil has been steadily rising, going from around $70 a barrel in July to nearly $100 in the past week. This is the highest price since Russia invaded last year, and it's been driven up by a series of unilateral production cuts by the world's biggest oil exporter, Saudi Arabia, which is now producing 1 million fewer barrels a day than its OPEC quota. So in this video, we're going to try and figure out why the Saudis are cutting production, even if it means lower revenues, how they're using oil for their geopolitical ends, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So why is Saudi Arabia voluntarily cutting oil production? Well, as we see it, there are three possible reasons. First, Saudi Arabia, and especially Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, commonly known as MBS, want structurally high oil prices to fund their ambitious Vision 2030 project. Second, in part because Saudi Arabia has fallen out with the US, they're no longer as sensitive to the political concerns of Western consumer countries. Third, it's possible that Saudi Arabia is pushing up oil prices to undermine renewable energy projects. So let's start with the first reason, Vision 2030. For those of you who don't know, Vision 2030 is MBS's hallmark project, first announced in 2016 to transform Saudi Arabia from a petrostate into an economically diverse regional superpower. Essentially, because Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter, its public finances and the entire economy rely very heavily on oil sales. Oil revenue accounts for about 3/4 of government revenue and about 1/3 of Saudi Arabia's entire GDP. MBS has decided that he wants to reduce Saudi Arabia's reliance on oil by using revenues to invest in other stuff, like education, sports and infrastructure, including a ridiculous 170-kilometre-long linear city called NEOM. To achieve this, MBS has decided that he needs to keep oil prices structurally and permanently high. This is why he's happy to take a short-term cut in revenue by unilaterally producing less than his OPEC quota in order to stabilise prices at a higher level, providing Saudi Arabia with a steadier stream of income to fund Vision 2030. The second reason is that Saudi Arabia is less sensitive to what the US wants. From about the 1970s until quite recently, the US and Saudi Arabia were close allies. The alliance was based on two things: a security guarantee from the US and petrodollar recycling, which involved the US spending dollars buying oil and the Saudis recycling those dollars, buying up American weapons or American government debt. In the past, if oil prices went too high, which would be bad news for both the US economy and its incumbent politicians, the Americans would usually be able to pressure the Saudis into getting OPEC to produce more oil. This started changing in the 2010s with the rise of American shale production and its gradual withdrawal from the Middle East, and relations have fallen to new lows under Biden, who accused the Saudis of murdering children in Yemen and promised to turn Saudi Arabia into a pariah state for the killing of journalist and dissident Jamal Khashoggi. Biden actually asked MBS to bring prices down before the midterms last year, but MBS ignored him and cut production anyway, demonstrating that the Saudis are no longer sensitive to America's domestic politics. The third reason MBS might want higher prices is that it's possible he's trying to use higher oil prices to undermine renewable or green energy projects. This might sound counterintuitive. After all, you'd expect high oil prices to accelerate the transition away from oil towards renewables. But because oil is so fundamental to the world economy, high oil prices create higher headline inflation, which central banks react to with higher interest rates. This is bad news for green energy projects, because renewables like solar, wind, hydropower, or even nuclear are all capital intensive. In other words, there's a big upfront cost to build them, but then you make your money back over time by selling your energy. This means you usually have to borrow quite a lot of money up front, so higher interest rates mean less borrowing and fewer green energy projects. To be clear, the Saudis have never said they want to get rid of renewable projects, but this is at least a convenient byproduct of higher prices. It's also worth saying that the Saudis did something similar in 2016, when they deliberately crashed the price of oil to bankrupt American shale producers. Essentially, fracking is quite an expensive production method, so the Saudis knew that if they kept the price of oil low for long enough, American shale producers would make a loss. Because fracking is also pretty capital intensive, a lot of shale producers had taken out big debts. So a sustained period of low prices essentially bankrupted a lot of them and scared other producers from getting into the industry. The Saudis were pretty explicit about all this as well. Their oil minister at the time bragged that Saudi Arabia enjoys lower production costs and that they would use this advantage to bring US shale to a quote inevitable reckoning. So that's why MBS wants higher prices. On to the second part of the video. Will it actually work? Well, it depends on a couple of things. First, it depends on supply. In other words, whether the Saudis can convince the rest of OPEC not to produce lots more oil to take advantage of Saudi's unilateral production cuts and the higher prices. The big player here is Russia, which is the world's second biggest oil exporter. Earlier this year, the Saudis and Russians fell out after the Russians secretly produced more oil than they were supposed to. But in the last few months, they've fallen back in line and are now actually producing 500,000 barrels a day, less than their OPEC quota. If, however, Russia's public finances come under strain, or Putin needs a windfall to fund his war in Ukraine, then tensions could re-emerge. Second, it depends on demand. In other words, how quickly the rest of the world can transition away from hydrocarbons towards green energy. History is on MBS's side here. Almost every year, politicians and analysts optimistically project oil demand to peak. But unfortunately for anyone who takes the green transition seriously, every year, demand just keeps growing. But perhaps the most difficult challenge for the Saudis here will be avoiding a global recession. Historically, oil prices have come in cycles. High oil prices cause global recessions, which mean lower demand, which means lower prices, which allows the global economy to restart, pushing up prices and restarting the cycle. If the Saudis push oil prices up too high, they risk depressing demand, which could bring prices crashing down. We saw some of this on Wednesday evening, when oil prices fell sharply after the US Environmental Investigation Agency announced that gasoline demand had fallen to a 25-year seasonal low. All in all, while the Saudis are enjoying a moment of immense geopolitical power right now, history suggests that oil prices will come back down eventually, bringing the Saudis with them. That's all we have time for today, but if you're the kind of person who wants to dive deeper into the more technical and analytical side of these stories, then you ought to check out the Daily Discussion, where our writing team are let loose to discuss stories just like this one, diving deeper into news stories and unpacking the hidden details that they found fascinating, but they're either too long or too academic to make it into the final script. If you want to check them out, you can find them exclusively on Nebula. And the best news is that Nebula is less than £2 a month and provides you with ad-free and exclusive videos from TLDR and a ton of incredible content from other creators like Johnny Harris, Real Life Law, and Legal Eagle. Check it out by clicking on the link in the description and make sure you use our link so they know that you came from us.